Well, welcome. It's so exciting to be back here. It feels like old home week at a light reading Informa event. I'm very honored to be back in the interviewer's chair, especially sitting here talking about spectrum. I think everybody knows my guest, Tricia Paoletta from the NTIA. I'm Mari Silbey with the National Spectrum Consortium. And for those of you who don't know, we have over 300 members across telecom, across defense, across the startup world and academia, all companies and organizations working on wireless spectrum challenges and new and innovative technologies. So before we get started, because I know we have a number of sort of broad topics to cover, I know in our prep call that you were sort of dealing with some information overload. You've been senior advisor on spectrum at NTIA since February.
Yes.
Yes. Are they
February
still making
17th.
you do February 17th? So
Months. Yeah.
almost exactly. And they're still making you do financial disclosure forms?
Yes. It's very stressful.
Yeah, there's no rest for a public servant. Okay, so let's start with some of the big spectrum mandates that came out last year in the reconciliation bill. We've got, I think, 800 megahertz of spectrum that have to be identified for commercial auction.
Right.
And at least 500 megahertz of that has to be coming from spectrum bands that are currently being used by federal agencies.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind that spectrum pipeline, but then also what are some of the spectrum bands that are currently under study?
Sure. Thank you, Mari, and thank you, Network X Americas and WGC for having me here. Yes, it doesn't say at least 500. It says 500. I know the head of our agency, who was here yesterday, does hope that we can exceed that. But 500 megahertz is a lot, as you all know, and those are not empty bands. There's lots of very important federal users in those bands, so it is a challenge. We feel the FCC has a slightly easier job because they have the 300 in spectrum that's already commercially allocated. And of course, they're moving out on that with targeting a C-band auction pretty soon, or at least they'll announce that pretty soon. But yeah, 500 megahertz of currently incumbent federal spectrum is our job. 200 megahertz within 2 years, and then an additional 300 megahertz, for that total 500 by July 2029. So yeah, we're working very hard.
July 29 doesn't even sound that far away anymore.
No, it's not far. So it's a ton of work. And I'm just advising there. We have a whole office full of people who are working very hard. And the federal agencies are working very hard at clearing that spectrum. It's, we've gone through a lot of different spectrum battles and, repurposing, cycles in the past. But everybody got the memo, literally, because after the Working Family Tax Cuts Act, the reconciliation bill you mentioned, the president last December put out his memorandum, and it kind of gave us more focus on where we're going to find those 500 megahertz. And what he laid out was, immediately begin the process to identify the upper 7 gigahertz band. And, so get those studies kicked off. And because it was identified, or not identified, I got to use these verbs very clearly, because the prior administration had put that band in the national spectrum strategy, we already had the funds to begin those studies. So we were, fortunate in that regard. So we're on target for 7 gigahertz, and that's specifically, both in the reconciliation bill and the presidential memorandum, that's 7125 to 7.4 gigahertz, 7,400. And we have to finish by this year those studies and send them to the White House. And we have to, again, begin thereafter identifying that band, and that's a specific verb, to the FCC to say, okay, you can auction this band. There are some protections in there for some of the science services, radio astronomy, so there will be some coordination zones, but we're working very hard on that band. The other bands that were maybe newer relative to U.S. government policy was the 2.7 gigahertz band, or 2690 to 2800 megahertz. We were also directed by the president to begin the process to study those bands, or that range, and then 4 gigahertz, and specifically 4.4 to 4.94 gigahertz. So we're working on all that. On 2.7, we got the tech panel, which NTIA chairs, and we've got FCC and the Office of Management and Budget on that panel with us. We sent over our package earlier April, and then OMB has sent that up to Congress on April 30th, and there is a 60-day required statutory congressional review period. So they're looking at that, and once that comes back down, then those monies will be released for the agencies, and it's primarily FAA and NOAA to begin looking at 2.7, beginning their studies. And in 4 gigahertz, we're in a similar pattern a little later, but we do hope to get the tech panel package wrapped and sent over to OMB later this spring. And we've also, in addition to the bands that the president laid out, we did already identify 5 megahertz in L-band, 1675 to 1680 for auction. Now, I know that the full band we're going to be studying, 1675 to 1695 megahertz, is not doesn't have the channelization that the current and next generations of Wi-Fi and and 6G are looking for. But that band is very much of interest to the direct-to-device players. So we've signaled to the FCC that we're going to be studying that 20 megahertz range for direct-to-device. And then if it works, they'll be able to auction that, at the proper time.
All right. So I have so many questions from there, but I want to start with, I'm sure many people here are not familiar with some of the processes that go on for some of the spectrum band studies and everything that goes into it, and then going up to Congress. It really is lengthy and complicated. I've sat on some of the spectrum study calls, and they are extensive, the number of federal agencies there. But you all have just launched spectrum.gov.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that's a portal for the public?
Yeah, no, thank you. We're very proud of that. Some wise person back in the annals of time at NTIA, I don't even know who, had reserved that URL. And we finally got all the content up and ready, and we launched that about a week ago. And it is meant to be a portal for people like you, people who care about spectrum, who are interested in where the band studies that I just mentioned, where we are in that progress. Has the tech panel sent it to the OMB? Have we heard back from Congress? That kind of thing. But we also have our red book in there, and that's the manual of whatever the long name of it is. It's the red book, and it basically says all our policies in different bands, and there are some classified annexes, but that's available for the public. We will have what NTIA and the FCC, well, the U.S. government generally, has sent to our regional prep body for the World Radio Conference. That's a body out of the Organization of American States. The acronym is CTEL. And we'll have on there what we've sent to CTEL for our positions for the World Radio Conference, and a lot more. So it's both for the public, but also for federal spectrum managers. There are some password-controlled sites in terms of use of federal spectrum and where applications are in that authorization process. So it's chock full of fascinating information.
Yeah, for spectrum nerds like us, it's great.
Exactly.
All right, so let's get into it a little bit. You mentioned sort of all of the federal equities and the difficulties with some of the federal agencies and existing use of some of this spectrum. How will, I think about the 2.7 gigahertz band, for example, and the fact that there are literally hundreds of radars in there being used by both FAA and DoD. That's a significant challenge. How are they expected to maintain mission performance while also potentially relocating or transitioning from those bands? And where do they relocate to?
Yeah, right. And NOAA has weather radar there as well. It's a very important band. And while we all love our 6G and our DOCSIS 4, we also, many of you probably flew here, right? I'm guessing some of you flew here, at least our friends from Asia and other ports of call. And you need radar to land planes, right? And predict the weather and make sure, whatever. We all know why you need weather radar. But the nice storyline of this is that those weather radar are very old. They're not very spectrally efficient. A lot of them were being aged out anyway. So this is an opportunity for both FAA and NOAA to actually acquire new radar. So, they are doing that, but that also means, you could have a spectrum auction, but you wouldn't be able to move into it until those new radars are installed. So we are looking to get that process done. And by the way, the spectrum auction proceeds have to cover the cost of those new radar. So it is kind of a complicated puzzle. But most likely, of course, we're still studying this, but most likely the notion is we might squeeze the federal radar up into the top portion of that band, so up above 2.8 gigahertz. But that also means the FCC has to do some work because there's commercial radar in 2.9, and they're going to have to make sure they don't, interfere with the government radar that might be squeezing up closer up to, getting closer to that band edge. So, the good news story is that hopefully that spectrum will be available for commercial, licensed full power use, but the government radar will get new and improved radar.
Yeah. So speaking of that, and you kind of touched on this, and I think specifically about the upper C-band at the moment, because we're looking at freeing up 200 megahertz in the upper C-band as some of the initial bands to go to auction. And it sounds like, the first 100 megahertz are going to be not easy, but relatively straightforward. And yet there's at least a lot of noise out there that the second 100 megahertz is going to cost a fair bit in terms of equipment upgrades. So how do you balance that? And where do you worry about the cost of relocation or transition, whatever that looks like, eating into the cost of some of those spectrum auction proceeds?
And I thought you said noise, you're making a spectrum joke. We just, love more interference. But of course,
wasn't even intentional, I swear.
So we know from the first C-band, right, rodeo, since we're in Irving, that yes, there was concern about interference to the radio altimeters of the planes, and that was painful for everybody involved. So I think the FCC has learned the lesson. I shouldn't say its lesson, because at the time I commended Chairman Pai for moving out, because the aviation community did come late to the party. I think they thought they could just play rope-a-dope and not engage, and it would go away, and their head of agency was more powerful than the Chairman Pai. But and they're anyway. So we're still having that problem, and of course it's a different problem, obviously. But now that there'll be basically 5G advanced or 6G, whatever, closer to the altimeter edge at 4.2, there will be issues. But I guess stay put. Thankfully, we're not the lead on that issue, so the FCC is going to have to deal with that, because it's a spectrum auction, commercial reallocation issue. But there is rumors afoot that there'll be a better process for dealing with the aviation altimeter upgrade this time around. But it won't. I don't expect it to go all the way up to 4.2. There will be a guard band, I assume.
I assume so as well.
Yeah.
We're already practically almost out of time, which is going to drive me crazy. But so you also alluded to most of the spectrum bands are expected to be auctioned off for high power exclusive licenses. Yeah. It's a little bit controversial, honestly, because spectrum is a finite resource, and it seems logical that we should be figuring out ways that different users can coexist in some of these mid-band frequencies, which have the best properties for both communications and sensing. So given that, and given where we are, what can the government do to be a catalyst for innovation around some of the R&D that has to take place for spectrum coexistence, for dealing with interference, all of those things? What is the government's role there?
Yeah. Well, and the statute does direct us to come up between us and the FCC with 800 megahertz of full power commercial licensed use, right? So that's our job, but it doesn't mean we've stopped at NTIA from working with different entities to see how we can improve the art of spectrum coexistence and sharing. We're doing a lot of work with Spectrum X, of course, and they're engaged in a number of different projects. I assume somebody in my organization is talking to somebody in your organization about additional cooperation. So we're still looking at ways to improve efficiency of a spectrum, and sharing is certainly among them. So we haven't just put our pencils down on that very important task.
That's very good to hear. I like that message. And real quickly, you want to mention the AI RAN innovation, the NOFO that you all have talked about?
Yes, I'll do that. Back in an earlier administration, right, Congress put out the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund. It was a very long name, but we basically just called it the Innovation Fund, but it was for Open RAN. And we still have a little bit of money in the kitty. So we are soon going to be putting out another notice of funding opportunity because it
Make
is
some news here and tell them all the details.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we've already pre-selected. With a winner, please stand up. No, we have about 50 million left in the kitty, but again, because it's 2026 and the president's focuses on exportable AI and winning the race to 6G, we're going to try to kind of refocus the ORAN. It will still be supported, or we're still going to be distributing funds on Open RAN, but we're really going to be looking for AI native solutions, for exportable AI technology, and stay tuned. We'll be releasing that later this spring.
That's great to hear, and I'm also very excited about some of the AI RAN work potentially working in concert with some of the other government investments that are happening around open source software in the RAN, and the way we can combine some of that with some of the AI RAN innovations. I think there's some great opportunities. We are out of time, but I'm going to ask one more question about the World Radio Conference, because that's coming up. What are the priorities for the U.S. there? What's at stake? Give us some parting thoughts on WRC.
Well, certainly maybe the priority for folks in this room is the mid-band spectrum study item, which does look at 4 gigahertz and 7 gigahertz for what they call IMT, but again, basically full power commercial license use. But frankly, the vast majority of agenda items on that agenda are satellite related, and they were put there, some by the satellite industry. Many of them were pushed by folks who view us as adversaries. I'll just say, well, maybe the BRICS, we could cover a lot of that. So they're very hostile to non-GSO players. So that is going to take up a lot of our time.
Well, better you than me.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause.
Thank you. Appreciate it.